let's talk a little bit about how we can apply some of the underlying tenets of rational choice theory. And so if you haven't seen the video where I discuss rational choice theory and sort of some of the historical components that led up to that within the classical school, definitely go check out those videos first. But this one is going to sort of apply some of those concepts to theories that have used those things. And environmental criminology as a whole has absolutely come from that same classical school approach and kind of is very much in line with the tenets of rational choice. So environmental criminology basically has to do with things involving the surrounding environment. So, and this is separate from something that's called green criminology, which is about things like that have to do with the environment, like things like that have to do with crimes against, pollution crimes and things like that. That's a separate thing. This is talking about environmental criminology is our situational components. So Brandingham and Brandingham were huge proponents of some of the theories within environmental criminology, and they really brought these ideas to the forefront. So they are major players here. And so they talked a lot about what's called the fourth dimension of crime. So the first three dimensions of crime we can consider to be the legal dimension, the fact that there is a crime being committed, the offender dimension, and the target dimension. And so the fourth dimension then is basically the location in time and space in which those first three dimensions intersect to result in that criminal event. So it is that spatiotemporal setting. And I mean, this can affect the commission of the crime, how the crime progresses. It can affect the outcome of the crime as much as any offender or victim specific variable. And so this was sort of the crux of environmental criminology, is this idea of the spatiotemporal elements. And so the Brandinghams talked about this awareness space that develops. And so through day-to-day activities, everybody develops an awareness space. So criminals and non-criminals alike, we develop this idea where we are familiar with this area. So we have sort of our nodes. So like our nodes would be right around, like, where we live, where we work, where we spend a lot of time doing something recreationally. So we develop these nodes where we are really familiar with that area. But then we also develop this awareness space between those areas. And so these are the places where, it's our route we take to get from home to work, or, from home to school, or wherever we're going on a regular basis. From school or work to like the skate park that we go to or whatever. So we develop this, we have these nodes that we really know those areas super well, but then we also have this awareness space between these nodes. And so basically the idea is that the familiarity and comfort within that awareness space makes it a prime choice for where a crime is going to be committed, because that's where an offender feels safe. And so crimes are not going to be committed like right around an offender's home or right around their work, or they're not going to commit crimes in like their areas that they feel like a sense of ownership, or they have a stake in those areas. So they're not going to commit crimes right around those areas, but the idea is that this awareness space that they know fairly well because they travel those routes fairly often, but they're not where their areas are. So those are the prime location where we're going to see, sort of where these stars are, we're going to see crimes happen. And so this is one of the many rational decisions that the offender has to make with their own best interests in mind. So they know the area well enough that they can easily commit the crime they're trying to commit, but they know how to get away, and so their chance of apprehension should be lower in these areas compared to areas that they don't know at all. So that awareness space can help us if we go backwards with it, through, this sort of leads us to geographic profiling, is that it takes those ideas of awareness space and those patterns to then try to figure out where crimes are, where criminals live or spend a lot of time based on where those crimes are committed. So geographic profiling was essentially invented by Kim Rossmo, and there he is. And it starts with the underlying assumption that is very similar to environmental criminology, but sort of that classical school and rational choice in general, with this idea that people aren't random. There are patterns that develop, and people don't just move randomly through their environment. There are very clear, understandable, predictable patterns that people take. And this means in terms of things like traveling from place to place, but where they spend time, how they spend that time. And so when people move about, they're not doing it in this haphazard, unpredictable way. It's actually very predictable. And so we can then use where offenders commit their crimes to figure out where they likely live. So geographic profiling uses the locations either of serial crimes or different aspects of a single crime, if there's enough information there, to sort of figure out where the highest likelihood is that this person probably either lives or at least spends a lot of time. And so it could be, it's going to actually figure out like where they work or a very frequent hangout or something like that, but it'll tell you kind of where to start looking, essentially. And so this comes from patterns based on hunting behavior and based on target locations. And so there's a lot of research about sort of the different hunting patterns that different serial offenders have. And I mean, hunting makes it sound like we're talking about something like serial murderers, but which it can apply to, but it also could be like, people who commit B&Es and they're serial burglars or serial robbers, or, so there's a lot of different types of crimes, or if somebody's stalking somebody. So it's not just like our murderers, but it would also apply to that. So a big thing about geographic profiling is that it is information management. So when you have a major case, especially of a serial offender, there is a lot of information. There's volumes of information generated during any major crime investigation. And so it's not like in CSI where they're like, oh, look, here's this single piece of evidence, and when we like identify where this came from, that solves the case. That's not what real crime investigations look like. A big part of it is that there are mounds and mounds of things to sift through and to go through and people to talk to, and so geographic profiling manages that information. It allows the prioritization of information, and so it's best applied in conjunction with other police investigative methods. And so it's a really helpful and useful method, because while most criminals are not serial in nature, most of the individuals, are, if they're committing a crime, they only commit like one or a couple, maybe a handful of crimes. Most crime is committed by serial offenders. So our serial offenders are the minority of offenders, but they're committing the majority of crimes. So while most, again, I'll say it again, while most criminals are not serial in nature, most crime is. And so we have a high proportion of offenses are committed by a small proportion of offenders. And so while this wouldn't be useful to solve every crime, it's going to be useful to solve the majority of crimes, or at least to help in that investigation process. So here's an example of what a geographic profiling map looks like. And so this doesn't really have sort of the map information, that's been kind of blurred out a little bit. But would be overlaid on top of a map, and it would literally, so these are different levels of probability. And so the red is the highest probability. And then as you go out to the orange, that's the second highest probability. And as you kind of go out further and further, the probability decreases that the person spends a lot of time in those areas. And so what investigators would do is they would use this to sort of say, well, let's start in these red and orange areas in terms of if we have 1,000 or more people to interview or to try to get information from, let's start with the people who live in those areas. Or if it's a commercial area, let's start with people who work in those areas. And so it allows that prioritization of where do we start. And so it doesn't mean that the person can't live somewhere out here or work somewhere in these areas. The probability is there, it's just lower. So you would start where the probability is higher. And that's the whole thing that geographic profiling does. And anytime Kim talks about this, he likes to really, really put forward that idea that geographic profiling does not solve crimes. This is not going to be that we look at this and say, oh, the offender lives right there. That's not how this works. It's one tool for police investigators to use to help with the mounds of information that they have to sift through. So when we look at sort of how we can apply rational choice theory to different types of crimes, let's sort of look at each one in turn to really talk about how these crimes are actually rational. So talking about theft. So is theft rational? It may seem random, but it's always a rational choice. Thieves choose targets that seem vulnerable. They choose locations. So for something like B&Es that have, a lot of people flowing through the area, so they'll be less likely to be noticed. Especially corner homes. Corner homes are the highest risk because there are multiple escape routes because they're on the corner. And commercial burglars target buildings with easy escape routes. They target, and both commercial and residential burglars are going to target places that don't have a lot of target hardening. So like locks or alarms or things like that. The less of that exists, the higher the likelihood that is going to be targeted. So it's clearly there are choices being made here. How about drug use? Is drug use rational? So the beginning of using drugs is a choice made based on the perception that, friends or family either endorse or encourage drug use. Maybe they're users themselves. So it's a rational decision made after seeing that there's little risk to the behavior. And then the continuation is of that drug use behavior is chosen due to the huge reward that drug use provides to people who are addicts. And so the major costs that are incurred when they try to stop something like withdrawal is sort of another reason that keeps them in. So if I keep getting my fix, I'm going to get this massive reward and I don't have to deal with this massive cost that if I try to stop, I'm going to go through withdrawal. So that's majorly motivating factors there. That is going to affect that weighing of costs and benefits. So it becomes like a choice a non-addict makes to eat or sleep. It's not really a choice. And when we look at dealers' distribution, they treat drug trade as a business. And there are a lot of calculated decisions to do things like increase profits, maintain clients, minimize the risk of detection by law enforcement. So that affects how, when they decide to deal, who they're going to trust, how to keep drugs as pure as possible so that their clients are happy and they return. So there are a lot of those decisions that go into this. So the actual distribution business is very rational in the sense that every aspect of that is clearly that rational choice. And if we look at something like, this is just an example of where we see the rationality of this crime. This is Insight, which is in Vancouver, and it's a safe injection site. And so this kind of goes to show that when somebody is an addict, like they will go out of their way to get that reward. And so Insight is one kind of way to reduce the harm associated with these types of behaviors. To make it sort of safer. So if these people are going to do this anyways, this provides a safer outlet for them to use drugs and, so that we don't have to share needles and there's somebody there. If somebody ODs, there's medical staff around. There are counselors there if they are interested in trying to quit. So it makes the choice a little bit safer because we know that they're going to be making that choice anyways. So what about violence? Is violence rational? Well, it's certainly a choice, and it serves specific goals. So while sometimes violence is planned meticulously, and other times it could be like a passionate response to provocation, it's always a choice made to serve specific goals. So one goal is control. Control is very common where the purpose is to control the victim, especially in cases if you think of like domestic violence or rape. Control is often the goal. Retribution is another common goal where they want to punish the victim for some perceived wrongdoing. And so they take the law into their own hands. So, for example, a drug dealer assaulting a thief who stole their stash, or the person who's supposed to be guarding a grow-up. And so then there's that retribution aspect. Deterrence is another one. So they want to stop somebody from doing something that aggravates or provokes them. So, the man who severely beats the guy who's been flirting with his girlfriend, or the prostitute who beats up the new girl that's on her turf. So it's about like, I'm trying to stop you from doing this or continuing to do this thing that I don't like. Reputation is another common one where violence is driven by the need to enhance reputation to make and it's to make themselves feel important. So, men who feel their masculinity is threatened, they're either going to beat each other up or they're going to beat the one threatening them, or, they're going to pick the big guy to beat up so that they can reassert their dominance and impress others, things like that. And then we can look at specific types of violence like robbers and murderers and sex offenders. So they all tend to choose vulnerable victims or targets with specific traits, depending on the motivation, of course. That specific trait might simply be availability and sort of being able to create that opportunity. Sex offenders in particular, especially child molesters, they often incorporate a grooming process into their offenses. And so this could be whether this is with children that they have access to through like employment or volunteer work or through family or online, but that grooming process absolutely shows that rationality. So even though we can't understand, we can't understand where that person was coming from to possibly be able to justify committing a crime like that, it's still rational from sort of the mindset of the offender. And it actually demonstrates a great deal of planning to desensitize a child to touch and sexual material. It takes time, it takes repetition. And you can have the same process in domestic violence, rape situations as well, especially when you think of the honeymoon period and sort of the cycle that it continues to go through. And, there's the assault, and then there's the honeymoon period where, so apologetic and gifts and being super nice, and then it kind of comes back around. That kind of shows that there is a rationality to this, because if it's predictable, then it's rational. And remember, rationality means in the sense of from the perception of the offender and that weighing of costs and benefits, and how humans would never commit or choose any kind of decision where they know that the bad outweighs the good. In their mind, the positives, the benefits have to outweigh any risks or negatives. So it's rational in that sense. And so in that sense, any of these crimes and any decision is rational. And that's sort of the beauty of rational choice theory.